precious it is that we are here together today. How precious. Yet I've had times in my life when being in religious community hasn't felt precious. It isn't always something I treasured. Maybe you've had times like this too. Instead of feeding us, our religious communities sometimes have depleted us. Maybe the worships felt empty and stale, or the community that you were in felt too conservative, or the community might not have recognized one of your needs. Or being there just felt like a chore with all of those volunteer hours that you were putting in. I know these times when I've been in religious community that felt out of balance, when it didn't feel precious at all. I've been there, and I know that I'm actually going to be there again. Yet I still proclaim this morning how precious it is we are here together in religious community with one another. And it's so precious because life is precarious. We have our doubts and our anxieties. We have to juggle work and family and school and community. We have to keep hope with the news of another tragedy. We have to keep hope in the face of a new diagnosis, and we yearn to find safety and refuge and help. Religious community is precious to me because this world is out of whack. In times when things are out of whack, we can dig deeper into our own traditions. We can connect with our family and our ancestry. We can search our religious and spiritual resources. And in fact, our religious communities become a counterbalance to that world that's out of whack. It doesn't just shield us from the negative parts of life. Religious community doesn't just shield us from the negative parts of life. It actually holds both. Religious community holds joy and it holds sorrow. It holds struggle and it holds solace. It holds hope and it holds despair. We don't retreat from the difficulties of the world when we're here in religious community, as Reverend Anna Levy-Lyons puts it, but instead we live in counterpoint to it. I love that phrase, we live in counterpoint to the modern world. Counterpoint, it comes, I think, from a musical term, where you have like a melody, and then you have a harmony, and you say that those two things are in counterpoint to one another. I'm getting empty looks from the... I might not have it just right. But that idea of like two melodies that sort of complement one another and add richness to one another is sort of what I want to lift up. We're not doing something different, but we're adding richness to the modern life that we live in. So, or another way to put it, it's not an either or. It's a both. I learned the lesson of both in my life fairly recently. Let me tell you how it happened. I probably talked about this from the pulpit before, how about 5 years ago I joined this big organizing project with a bunch of people who were young adults my age. And a friend had invited me along. And the leadership of this organizing collective had a strong value around emotional vulnerability, sharing what's on our hearts, and talking about our feelings and things like that. And we did this through a practice that's maybe familiar to many of us here in our communities, through check-in. So at the beginning of every meeting, going around and sharing how we're doing. And we also learned this skill, everyone learned this skill called active listening, which active listening, kind of a fancy name, but I think what it is just tells you the rules of how to actually listen like a caring human being. So we learned active listening, and what that showed me is that this organizing group, this community that I was now a part of, was committed to practicing a certain type of openness and emotional vulnerability, and we valued that very strongly. Now, this hit me in a time of my life when I was pretty lonely. I was in transition in my communities. I was in a job that took a lot of my time but didn't really create those like social connections that I sort of usually lean on. And so coming to this community that was so open with its feelings was like arriving at an oasis in the middle of a desert. It nourished me in a way that I had longed for, but I hadn't even realized that I was longing for it until I found it. And I did something funny. I turned that way of being into a capital T truth. I became judgmental of people who weren't open and vulnerable. I wanted everyone to convert to my way of being, this lovely way of being that I had discovered. And I was getting to experience with my organizing buddies. I thought, if we could just go out and get everyone in the whole entire world to do check-in every week, we would solve all the world's problems. And we'd ask them to talk about their feelings and their underlying needs, and we'd just make the world a better place. Now, don't get me wrong. I really still love to talk about my feelings. And I guess that we could stand to be a little bit more emotionally vulnerable in the world in general, and that we should work for a world where people can be open and vulnerable. That's a possibility for everyone. But I was confusing my truth about the way I like to be in my interior life with the truth of how it should be for everyone. And what I think I was also disregarding was that there are other ways to approach our interior lives. There are other ways to approach our interior lives other than verbally processing out loud, right? There's other ways. I learned this while I was working at a hospital 2 summers ago, and I would watch the nurses go about their day. And they would go from one encounter with a very difficult family, and then they'd be in another room, and there'd be a crisis with a certain patient, and then they'd go to the third room, and they would see someone they had been caring for years passing away. Just one intense experience after another. And those nurses weren't about to go out and, between rooms, weren't about to go and process all their feelings and talk about what it meant to witness the suffering of humanity. Because they had a job to do, right? They had to move on from one room to another, from one situation to another. And God willing, when they got home, they had some way to sort of process out the day and, take all it in. But it was my admiration for those strong-willed and steely-nerved nurses that I worked with that helped me silence the judgmental side that I had been having. I think we need both times in our lives and peoples in our communities who can delve deeply into vulnerable things, and we need to have times in our lives and people in our communities who can stay focused and driven to get the things done. So that is the truth. I realized the truth was not just one way of being over another, but it was some sort of balance between both and. Now, I'll pause at this moment of speaking with you to be very clear about something. This balance of both and that I'm talking about is not the same thing as some false equivalence like bad people on both sides, or superficially addressing multiple perspectives like fair and balanced. I'm talking about a certain type of balance that we are navigating in liberal religious community together. And I think about it almost like we're all navigating, we're all in this balancing beam together. And we're trying to make do. We're trying to hold many different ways of being all together at the same time. We're holding many truths in balance with one another. And I think liberal religious communities like the ones we're part of here are doing that in 3 really special ways. And I want to just name those 3 special ways. One is around solidarity. So anytime we talk about the idea that we come to a community that shares values together. We come together in liberal religious community to build solidarity with one another amidst a very conflicted world. The second way I see it happening is that we have precious counterexamples. That in liberal religious community, we are safeguarding ways of being that are very different from the typical way of being. I think about all the music that our wonderful musicians have been singing today about the simplicity and coming to peace. And I think about the context that those songs might have been written amidst very much busyness, or like the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and these precious moments of peace that we find together in religious community as like a counterexample. And the third way I think we do this in liberal religious community is that we actually change the whole situation of the balance by shifting the fulcrum. We basically work to create justice and equity and community together. So let me talk about a little bit of those three a little bit more deeply. We come to community here together, and what we have the opportunity to offer each other is solidarity. There's a story from about 50 years ago within our congregational community when it was in 1971, and there were a bunch of sailors who were heading off they had been deployed to go to war in Vietnam. And these 9 active duty sailors had been deployed, but they made a decision. They made a decision to disobey the orders to go to war. And they reached out to many of the religious communities in San Diego to seek sanctuary during this time, so that they would be supported in their act of civil disobedience. And we are Unitarian Universalists, after all. We had a big meeting about it, and a big congregational meeting that went on for, I imagine, a very long time. And it was very contentious because the whole congregational community had to decide what it felt about its values, perhaps around peace and justice, and also its values around, like, was it going to follow the laws of the federal government, or was it going to disobey? Our community was faced with a choice. And at the end of this congregational community, we eventually made a decision. And that decision was to sponsor symbolic sanctuary, which was not exactly the same thing as offering like a place to live, but we were in support through resources and through advocacy, and we voted to support these sailors in their time. And I'm not coming down one way or another on that congregational vote 50 years ago, but what I think is really important is that the congregation together got to figure out what it believed, and then to make it real in the world, to live out its values. There's this Quaker author and theologian, his name is Parker Palmer, and he has this term of communities of congruence. He says that what we are offered sometimes in communities like this is we get to live out a life where the way the world is, or the way our community is more in line with the way we hope things to be. And that's a recognition that it doesn't happen everywhere in the world, but when we come to religious community here together, we have this opportunity for solidarity with one another. The second part of this living on the balance beam that I want to sort of explore with you is around the idea of a counterexample. So this idea that the world is so out of whack, and we come to religious community to find another way of being, another way that gives us hope, right? And you don't have to look any further for an example of this, the richness of a counterexample, than the story that Tony told us in Tony's reflection about the older boy who stood up for the newcomer, and who, through his empathic action, he was able to change the norm within that group. And it's true. That did not change the material conditions of these boys' lives in terms of their status as incarcerated. But it offered them hope. and it offered them community, and it offered a way to hold that despair that that young new boy was feeling. And that matters. And I think holding that up and protecting that is really, really important. I think about our counterexamples as almost very heavy, dense weights. Like instead of being made out of stone, they're made out of very dense metal, and you put them on the balancing beam, and even though it seems like everything's skewed this way, suddenly that weight gets put on, and suddenly it feels okay. These counterexamples, they might not come around as often as the other ones, but they matter to us, and we need to preserve them. And sometimes our counterexamples in our religious community don't look as beautiful and wonderful as the example that Tony gave us. Sometimes that counterexample are those voices within our community who are kind of a thorn in our side, who are sort of urging us on to a viewpoint that we haven't yet taken up and are seeing things in a new way that's going to help our community grow and are pushing us to grow. Sometimes that, preserving that, those voices and lifting them up in our community is the work that we do to create balance in community. And the last way that I see us living out liberal religious community on the balance beam is that we work to move the fulcrum from a situation of imbalance into the center in a situation of balance. There are a lot of things in our society that create imbalance. And we talk about them explicitly here in religious community. We talk about racism, and we talk about sexism, we talk about materialism, we talk about Islamophobia, we talk about individualism, and I could keep going on with the different ways that we seek to name the imbalances of society. But we don't just seek to name them, we seek to do something about them. You might notice when we were in a situation of imbalance during the Time for All Ages, when we started and the fulcrum was off-center, we had to spend a lot of time on one of the ends of the balance, really just piling stone after stone until we could get to a point where things were even, right? And in the same way, sometimes we spend a lot of time in religious community sort of identifying an imbalance, a way that people are not being treated equally, or a way that people are not feeling welcomed. And we spend a lot of time sort of seeking to correct that imbalance. And sometimes you might take a step back and be like, why are we still talking about X? Or like, didn't we talk about that last year and sort of sort it out? But the truth of the matter is we keep adding weights to the other side, the unbalanced side, as a way to collectively create a balance. But I think the second part of it is that when we come to a sense of balance, then we get the opportunity to be makers of our community. We get to create the ways of being together that move the fulcrum so that the situation is more even. You with me on this metaphor? We both use our stones to sort of correct an imbalance, but then we also are the own makers of our community. And we can make an example of a way of being together that is a little bit more balanced, that is a little bit more just, and that has everything to do with equity. When I look around in this room here, I know that each of us, just as we added our stones to the balancing beam, that each of us can offer to one another a form of precious hope found in the practice of balancing together in community. So I ask, may we call one another and ourselves back to the greater stores of compassion and understanding that we find when we bring an eye to the balance. May we create the conditions together where we can all bring fuller versions of ourselves into expression, and may we struggle to safeguard those precious counterexamples of love and justice in this fraught world. We are all on this balancing beam. May it be our responsibility to tend to it, and may this practice of tending to the balance bring us purpose as as we continue to realize His hope for our world. Amen.
I invite you to rise.